Dámy a pánové, vážení hosté, já vás tady velmi srdečně vítám v Nejvyšším purkrabství na Pražském hradě. A scházíme se tady dnes podruhé u přednáškového cyklu Věda na Hradě, kterou organizuje Správa Pražského hradu společně s Ústavem organické chemie a biochemie Akademie věd České republiky a také Univerzitou Karlovou. A dneska máme vzácného hosta, britskou profesorku Ruth Mace z UCL z Londýna. A velmi se těšíme, že se dozvíme něco nového. A bych poprosila tady kolegu pana Petra Turečka, kdyby byl tak laskav a naši vzácnou hostku představil. Děkuji.
Okay. Thank you, Veronica. It is my great pleasure to introduce Ruth Mace because she is one of the 3 people basically that I've seen giving a plenary talk at my very first conference. I had completely different plans with my life. I wanted to be a graphical designer for a museum or something. And by accident, I was also doing a master's degree here at Charles University. And there was David Perret, Chris Stringer from Natural History Museum London, and Ruth Mace. And it was so awesome. Basically, she's able to combine methods from anthropology, behavioral ecology, phylogenetics, whatever. It's amazing. That's how, in my opinion, behavioral science should look like. That's in the nutshell. And maybe just a few remarks. She graduated from the University of Oxford. She is now working, as was already said, at UCL, University College London, and she was also a visiting professor in Lausanne, China, right? Something like that. And what's also very important for me and for the scientific community in Europe, she served as a president of EB, which is Evolutionary Human Behavior European Association or something like that, which is a perfect society full of nice, charming people, and it hosts one of the greatest conferences, in my opinion. So this is all what is behind Ruth Mace, and she will now tell you what she's working on right now and what are the results. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Now, this thing is refusing to talk to that, so if I sit down, it's just because I have to keep pressing. But anyway, I'm an evolutionary anthropologist, which means I'm particularly interested in the evolution of behaviour, and one of the things I got very interested in lately, which actually this grant was really about, is trying to understand those behaviours that don't make sense in evolutionary terms. And religious celibacy is certainly one of those things. So how can you understand it if we're an evolved being? You know, why do human beings put a lot of time and effort into things that have no obvious, immediate payoff? So religions have all kinds of costly obligations, and I'm going to be telling you today about studies that we did in Tibet, in Western China. And these are 2 Tibetan guys who've climbed up a mountain, and they're throwing prayer papers up to various Buddhas who are riding around in the sky on horseback. And so there's prayer. This is Lhasa, the most important temple in Lhasa. If you go there in winter, people have come from all over Tibet to pray. And you'll see them prostrating on the ground, and also people are constantly circumambulating the temple, so everyone's walking, you have to walk a certain direction. And this goes on through the pilgrimage season. This just goes on day and night and day and night and day and night, so it's a hugely costly, expensive activity. And some people arrive going on long pilgrimages where every 3rd step you have to prostrate yourself. So can you imagine the energy that's expended in doing this? There's a great film about a whole village that does this, and they walk for 3 months to get to Lhasa. And I was talking to people in Lassen, and they said, no one does that anymore. And I just drove. I was about 50 miles outside Lassen and came into these guys. So everybody is still doing this. And just imagine the calories burnt when you just do that for weeks on end. And women do it too sometimes. Some villages still have costly rituals, which I'll whiz on with that one in case anyone doesn't like the sight of blood, but costly rituals that involve cutting and whatever. And also, it's not just sort of bodily expression of towards your religion, but money as well. So not especially wealthy people will pay vast amounts of money to the monastery, and you literally sometimes seen people throwing handfuls of cash on certain occasions. So one reason might be, so this is on most Tibetan Buddhist temples, you'll see this picture, something like that. So everyone believes in reincarnation, and being a good person increases your chances of coming back in a good place. So let's try and use this thing. Ooh, okay. So you've got, wow, that's anyway. So this is like, they sometimes call it the circle of suffering because you can't really get out of it. And you don't want to end up anything in the bottom half here. There's 6 different forms of hell, and you don't want to be in any of them. There's something to do with water, fire, whatever. You may come back, hopefully, on Earth as maybe an animal, or better still, a farmer. And if you're very good, you may come back as a monk. And you may even, if you manage to just create an amazing life, you might escape the circle of suffering as a Buddha, which is what they're sort of drawing here. And some living Buddhas choose to come back to Earth and help the living, as this guy did when we were there. So there he's blessing a couple of my PhD students for a fee. So we're all good. We've got a seal of approval. So the question is, one of the scientific questions that's sort of in our field is, what drives behavior? So if we're trying to understand why Tibetans are putting so much energy into these costly behaviors, is it because their religious beliefs are just sort of telling them to do that, and that's what's driving behavior? Or where does ecology fit in? Is it that these behaviors were somehow there anyway, and the religious beliefs are just a code for how you live your life? So some people sort of think that the arrows are this way, so cultural norms establish how you behave, whereas others might put more attention to these people behave differently from these people because of their ecology, and that gets coded in religious beliefs. Now, it might not be one or the other, it might be a bit of both, because I put arrows in all directions, really. But so, for example, you might think that Christians are monogamous and Muslims don't have to be monogamous because of their religious rules, and that's why there's a difference. Or you might say, well, Christianity arose, in the Roman Empire where that monogamy was already established, and Islam arose in the Arabian Peninsula where there were nomadic pastoralists who were already polygynous, and therefore it's not the religion that's guiding the behavior, it's the ecology of that system that's just being coded. And if that's the case, then this sort of sort of cultural evolution models tend to assume it's the other way around, whereas I would probably put myself more in the behavioral ecology camp, where if that's the case, we can use behavioral ecology, which is a technical word for trying to understand how ecology drives the evolution of behavior, to try and understand even cultural behaviors like religious beliefs. Okay, so the particular behavior I'm going to talk about today is sending your child off to the monastery to live as a celibate monk for his entire life, so he'll never reproduce. So the monasteries used to be really important seats of learning and power. If you go to some of the bigger monasteries, they're still functioning. Obviously, they don't have political power anymore, but they're still very influential, and they really remind me of universities because they function as a temple, they function as like they teach, they could lend you money. So they're sort of temple, university, school, bank, court, all rolled into one. So they were incredibly important institutions in their day. And this is one of the monasteries in Lhasa where most afternoons they do this debating. It's very formalised, as you can see. I'm not quite sure whether they're actually debating, whether they just kind of... And it's like we have a programme in Britain called University Challenge. They go and visit each other and they have debating competitions. And so it's really very much like a university. Oh, sorry. Okay, so let's try this thing. Here's China. Where's... I'm going to lost my... it's not working anymore. Doesn't want to work. Oh, it's come back. Where is it? Ah, there we go. Sorry, I haven't got used to this thing. So China is... Tibet is absolutely huge. So this is old China, and then the Tibetan plateau starts about here and goes all the way west. And so those photos I was showing you from Lhasa are about a 25-hour train ride across Tibet, which I don't even know if you can do it at the moment, but it's definitely worth doing. But I was doing my research near the University of Lanzhou, which is at this end of the Tibetan plateau, which is a very rural area, a lot of yak herding, and it's sort of really kind of out in the countryside. And this is a monastery, and you can see that because people are mostly nomad, so we're right up on the Tibetan plateau now, and this is in summer, and most people are nomadic, and really the only towns previously would have been a cluster of houses around the monasteries, which is partly where the monks are living, but it's also where old people might settle if the nomadic life gets too much for them and they just want to concentrate on religious activities. But now, as everyone's settling, they're building up to be more and more. Actually, when we visited this particular monastery, there was nobody there. The whole building was completely empty. We wandered around. And then we found someone, and they said, no, they're all on holiday. They're on summer holiday. They're all camping on the field over there. So you see all the white tents over in the corner. So we went over to visit them. And here are some baby monks playing ping pong. And you can see that it's a really tough life. So this is on the Tibetan Plateau. They're not allowed to wear shirts. They're not allowed to wear trousers. So you can see what they're wearing. And this is August, and it's still quite cold. And it's a really hard life. And they don't spend most of their time playing. You can see they're useless at ping pong because they've never done it before. I mean, they only do it like 2 weeks a year. And the rest of the time they are praying and learning and learning scriptures or whatever. And you see the guy there who's wearing the warm clothes. I mean, that's the brother of one of the monks who's just come to kind of join in the play and say hi to his brother. And as I say, they spend a lot of time praying. They didn't want me to take photos of praying. Those are their boots outside the prayer hall, or working, doing exams. This made me laugh. This is a list of their exam results next to a list of how much their parents had donated to the monastery, which reminded me a bit of emails I got from my son's American university. When they're young, so they might go at age 7 or 8 or 9 or 10, but, you know, pre-teenage. And especially when they're young, many of them keep strong contacts with their family. And people talk about having a family monk. So even though they're spending more and more time not in contact with the family, they'll be called back for what, you know, when they're needed for like religious functions. So the monks, even though they live out of the village in a monastery that's normally up on a hillside somewhere and away from everyone else, they do come back. And we got data about the monks not by talking to people in the monastery, that would have been quite hard, but we just basically did a demographic survey of all the villages all around, and then in that survey asked everyone what all their relatives did. So we built these family trees of villages, and they told us what everyone was doing and who was married to who and whose child was who, and that included if anyone was a monk. And we realised that a lot of the children were monks or adults. Oh, sorry, that's not working. So this is the proportion now. Or when we did this, this was 2017, 18. Quite a large proportion, if you consider that this means, you know, stepping out of normal family life and going and living in an institution. And when you read historical records, these numbers were much, much higher. So I got this photo from the internet, but you can see how many monks were in these institutions. I mean, they were enormous institutions. So it's like one village in 7 is kind of like all male. And it's a very unusual phenomenon and non-reproductive, which to an evolutionary biologist is a challenge. And this particular picture, they're actually, I think they're actually being, this is the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, and they're being told to go home. So all the monasteries were closed down, and they were closed for, they were sort of closed for nearly 12 years, but they just bounced back again when they were allowed to reopen. So in fact, in our data, if you look at people who are sort of in their late 60s and 70s, there's lots of people who said they used to be monks, but they were sent home, so they never became monks. So there's no monks really of this age. But then they bounced back. Okay, so why be a monk? So when I say why, I gave this talk somewhere where and I advertised the title as Why Be a Monk? And there was a Franciscan monk in the audience, and he said to me, oh, I thought you were going to talk about the spiritual aspects of it. So I'm not going to talk about the spiritual aspects of it. I'm talking about the evolutionary aspects of it, and as an evolutionary puzzle. And so given these sort of two models of evolution and behaviour, is it that the sort of monasteries are powerful cultural institutions, they need children to support them, so they're putting a lot of pressure on the villages? So sometimes, I mean, at the moment they sort of say it's 1 boy in 7, and there's times in history where it's been as high as like 1 boy in 5 or even 1 boy in 3. And is it something that parents are just kind of tolerating, even though obviously as an evolutionary anthropologist, if you think in terms of your Darwinian fitness or the number of children that you raise the next generation, it's extremely costly to raise a child and then say, okay, that child is not going to reproduce. So that's a bit of a puzzle. Or is it something that is actually beneficial in terms of fitness to the family, and therefore they've created these institutions because they want them to exist? So how would you test a hypothesis that being a monk was good or not good for your household fitness, as it were? By fitness, I mean like Darwinian fitness. So behavioral ecology is just kind of like other science, I guess. You make your model, your hypothesis. Hopefully, if your model is a good or interesting model, it's generated some predictions about what the patterning of that behaviour is going to look like, or how it's going to be spread in ecological conditions. And then you test your model. And if your model doesn't work, I mean, all models are wrong at some level. So the idea is you then go back and you improve your model, or you change your model, or whatever. And that's how the process works. So with my postdoc Alberto Micheletti, we were interested in doing a kin selection model of being a monk. So a kin selection model looks at whether a gene, so I mean, it's a mathematical. I'm not saying that there's a gene for being a monk, but it's the same maths, whether it's a gene or a cultural trait. And we're asking if you had the trait that was to just go off and be celibate and step out of village life and go and join a monastery and abstain, you know, would that gene ever spread? I mean, could that cultural trait evolve, or could it, as a genetic trait, evolve? And on the face of it, the answer would probably be no. Okay, if you don't like maths, don't worry, but here we are, just to very quickly. So the way that it models is, let's see if we can make this thing work again. Okay, there's a huge cost associated with being a monk because you have no children whatsoever. But what these models actually take into account is that basically you're sort of freeing up some, if you think of a village as a whole load of reproductive opportunities, if you're stepping out of the competition, you're freeing up opportunities for everyone else in the village. And if those people are related to you, then there is some benefit to that. So this term is the cost that you're paying, but this is the benefit that you're getting through your inclusive fitness, which is just mathematically, it sort of works out as that. But some of the people in the village are dispersing, and some strangers are coming in who are not related to you at all. But some people in the village are related to you. But this term makes sure that this can never be bigger than this. So this is completely impossible to evolve. So just like we thought, there's no reason why you would just give up celibacy. It's just not favoured by natural selection. And what about if your parents are making you celibate? So these are very young, these monks, when they go to the monastery. It's not really their decision, to be honest. It's the same equation, but you just factor it by the parents' relatedness to the child, and it doesn't make any difference. So celibacy shouldn't evolve. But what we actually thought is, what about if the benefits are not to the whole village, but a big part of the benefit is actually to your brothers? So it's immediately within your family. So then you just add another term to this equation. So the cost to you as a little monk is still big, but your brothers get a large part of the benefit of you freeing everything up, and the rest of the village gets what's left. And if you model it like that, there are occasions where celibacy might evolve at a low frequency. And if you put it under parental control, it's rather interesting, because your parents are not just interested in you, they're interested in all the family. So it's not uncommon in human societies, or indeed in animal societies, for parents to favour one or certain individuals of their offspring over others, and therefore, because they're looking at the reproductive success of all their offspring, whereas you, the child, are more interested in your own individual fitness. They're looking at the whole family. So it might evolve in those circumstances. So if you don't want to worry about the maths, I can just show you the graph. So if the decision to be a monk was being made by the little boy himself, we would expect a very low frequency of religious celibates in the population, which is actually what we see when the decision is made by individuals themselves. And only then if the benefit to brothers was quite large. But if you assume the decision is made by the father or the mother, who have the interests of the whole family, then it is actually possible for quite large numbers of celibates to be driven by natural selection, which would suggest that what they're actually doing is benefiting their brothers by stepping out of the competition. So we wanted to test that, and sure enough, we found that if your brother was a monk, you had when I say reproductive success, I basically mean we measured how many children everyone had that survived, and it was good for you if your brother was a monk. So that term in our model of benefit to brothers we could support. And it's actually almost the same as if you didn't have a brother at all. So basically what's happening is brothers are intensely competing for the resources in this very sort of harsh environment of the Tibetan plateau. And therefore, parents actually don't really want to have to divide up their yak herd or divide up their house between several sons. And so competition between brothers is, we think, driving this. Very much to do with wealth inheritance. So it's not always the firstborn who inherits, but it normally is. And the others, even if they're not monks, they have to go and find somewhere else to live, basically. And we could show that quite clearly. So for your sister, it didn't really do any good, you being a monk. So it was competition between brothers for wealth inheritance. And the reason for that is that in traditional Tibetan society, wealth is passed down the male line. So the males are competing for the family resources, whereas the wealth of a woman is more determined by who she marries than what she gets from her parents. So that competition is not there. And what about the grandfather? Well, he's the one that's really making the decision. And if we're looking at grandchildren, say, how many grandchildren do you have if you send off one of your sons to go and be a monk? And the answer is not less and possibly more. So this competition is really intense. So what we thought was sort of an evolutionary puzzle turned out not a huge, an evolutionary cost, if you like, turned out not to be. Oops. So in terms of our two scenarios, I don't think there is evidence that monasteries are forcing families sort of to donate children against their sort of fitness interests. That it doesn't actually seem to be, whilst it's costly to the boy, and therefore it's not surprising that he might be sent at a young age, it's not costly to the family. Okay, what about women, actually? So I haven't mentioned too much other than the fact that they didn't really benefit from having a monk brother very much. We did another study, as part of the same study, where we actually looked at workloads. And I mean, there is a phrase in China, women, from Mao, I think, women hold up half the sky. But when looking at workloads, the pink line was the women and the blue line was the men. So the women are actually doing a lot more physical hard work. Not a lot more, but significantly more. Physical hard work. These are actually than the men. And we looked at what predicted that. And we actually found three things. A female biased sex ratio, I'll explain these in a minute, dispersing at marriage and just being female. All three were statistically significant factors which affected how much work you had to do in daily life, which we interpret as kind of decreased bargaining power. So how do we measure that? Well, we actually encouraged, we broadened the sample out to about 6 different sites and encouraged people to wear Fitbits, men and women. And to cut a long story short, these different sites had different dispersal patterns. So some of them women moved at marriage, some of them women didn't move at marriage, so we could isolate all these different effects. And some of them had monasteries nearby, and lots of people had gone off as monks, and some of them didn't. So the sex ratio was varying a lot. And so one of the kind of side effects of having all these boys disappear from the marriage market is that the sex ratio gets quite female biased in the villages. And one of the sort of predictions from behavioral ecology is that if you have a female biased sex ratio, then females lose bargaining power because, for example, if you were to feel that you were taking an unfair share of the burden in your marriage in terms of workload, the options of divorce are not very enticing if there's a shortage of men. So we actually found, this is a theoretical prediction, which we found through the Fitbit data, actually, that the more female biased the sex ratio was, the harder the women were working. So it's actually driving this kind of gender inequality. So the males who are not going to the monastery are having a great time. Well, they are actually working quite hard, but not as hard as the women. And the women are working extremely hard. And it was only really in those villages where the sex ratio was about 50-50 that we found the workloads got more balanced. So it's a strange kind of ecological sort of pincer movement here. So that's a yak. I don't think it's quite that big. I think it's the camera angle makes it look huge, but I mean, they are quite big. Nearly all the milking and everything is done by women. And nomadic pastoralist groups that keep livestock tend to have this male-biased wealth inheritance. The livestock tends to go down the male line, which makes male sibling competition, which is what we think is making the monks, which is what we think is making the sex ratio biased, which is leading to high women's workload. And also, we also found that just dispersing at marriage also puts you're surrounded by non-relatives instead of close family. That seems to put you at a higher workload as well. So one of the kind of side effects of this mass monasticism was almost that women working incredibly hard. I mean, they were getting up like 2 hours before dawn and working all day long. And they are so tough. And every now and then they get fed up with all the publicity of all those men going up Everest and stuff, and they just whiz up Everest to show that they can do it at twice the speed and come down again. But they are so, so tough. I mean, they are just working very, very hard. And we were able to isolate some of the factors that were kind of driving that gender inequality. Okay, so what about female religious celibates? Well, actually, in that area, there were very few. Like, there were some nuns, but 92% of the religious celibates were male. But we have a look. There's not much quantitative data sets, actually. Ours was one. We found one from medieval England, and actually monks and nuns were more or less equal. And Alberto found one from early modern Italy, Venice, I think it was, where there were way more nuns than monks. So what drives these differences? Well, so we sort of expanded the model to not just look at monks, but to look at monks and nuns. And it's basically the same model, whereas if you remember, it's like we think that competition between brothers is what's driving the monks. And if you just add females into the model as well, then it equally applies. So if there's competition between sisters, maybe that's driving nuns. So this is just a kind of map of it. What would you expect to see the balance of monks to nuns be depending on sister competition versus brother competition? And you also have to think about brother-sister competition in that model as well, so it gets a bit more complicated. But if we put brother competition and sister competition as a continuum on one axis and and between sex, you get a sort of map of competition where in this area, the blue areas you'd expect to see lots of monks, and in the yellow areas you'd expect to see lots of nuns. So we look for evidence for that. So those three data sets I told you about, so the Tibetan one is down here where we found mostly monks, where there's not really much sister competition because traditionally women didn't have many land rights or anything. They just moved into their husbands' houses, so they didn't really cost their parents anything in terms of marriage payment. In medieval England, it's monogamous, and had women have more rights and they have dowries, so they're beginning to get a little bit more costly. So some sister competition for parental wealth is sort of coming in. And the data from early modern Italy was there was massive dowry inflation apparently, so which is something that happens. I mean, it's happened more recently in India as well. And huge competition between females, because children were becoming so expensive, and a very large, and in that scenario there were way more nuns than monks. So anecdotally, that seemed to support our model. But how would we just to say how this marriage competition works, we've talked about bargaining power. Okay, so you can think about human marriage systems, or indeed any kind of mating systems, as this sort of competition for attracting a spouse, basically. And humans can pay huge amounts of money to try and make their offspring attractive in this bargain, right? And sometimes it's what's known as bride price, which is when the groom's family are almost buying the bride. They're transferring wealth to the bride's father or the bride's family at marriage in exchange for the bride, as it were. So the wealth transfer is going from the groom's family to the bride's family. And that's the most common pattern around the world, by the way. But also, you might see dowry, which is normally when money's going the other way. So, and it's very interesting that where you see dowry is under monogamy. So the reason we think this is happening is that if you live in a polygynous society, and lots of pastoralist societies, like the Tibetans I just showed you, wealthy men might have more than one wife. So in a way, there's not too much competition to marry the wealthiest man, because it's actually the men who are competing to try and get the most number of wives. And the wives, there's not much difference between marrying a rich man and a poor man, because if you marry a rich man, you have to sort of share, your children are some among many that have to share this wealth. Whereas under monogamy, there's no sharing. So if you get the richest guy as a woman, you're laughing because your children get all that wealth. So it suddenly sets up huge competition between women for the richest guy. So in the polygynous societies, it's the men that are competing. In the monogamous societies, well, everyone's competing, but especially the women are competing. And so parents provide dowry. They're sort of putting money on their daughter's head, saying, sometimes literally saying, you know, marry me, because I've got all this stuff. So if you look around the world, you find that dowry is associated with monogamy, and bride price is associated with polygyny. And so we thought, well, that's how you can measure female-female competition or male-male competition. So maybe rather than having our 3 case studies, we could look more broadly and see whether bride price is associated with societies that have monks, and dowry is associated with societies that have nuns. So as I said, there weren't really very many databases, because most anthropology is not really very quantitative. We're quite unusual in this respect. But there's big sort of literary collections of ethnographic texts that have been collected. So one's called the Ethnographic Atlas. There's another database called DBase. So we did a sort of word search. So they have paragraphs from these ethnographies. And, sorry, the writing's too small here, but we looked for the words monk, monastery, nun, nunnery, and sort of related words. And just to kind of get quantitative measure of whether a society had more monks than nuns or didn't have any. And in fact, out of 350 societies, 300 didn't have any. But of the 50 or 55 or so that did, the word monk or monastery came up 10 times more often than the word nun or nunnery. So that's not very scientific, but it kind of suggests that monks and monasteries are more common than nuns and nunneries, at least in anthropological texts. But it gives you a way of sort of looking at the distribution of the trait around the world. And we looked across lots of different religions, so most of them were within Buddhism and Christianity, which are the pink and the green. There was one solitary society that was Islamic that had monks. I think that was Albania, actually. And a few other indigenous societies. But it enabled us to kind of test our hypothesis on a much more global scale. And sure enough, our hypothesis was supported. So polygyny and bride price were associated with the societies that had more monks than nuns, and polyandry, monogamy, and dowry were actually more associated with the whole practice of religious celibacy anyway, and with more likely to find more nuns. So it did go the way we predicted. So even on a sort of a more global scale, it seemed to work. So going back to our kind of two characteristic models, this approach that I've been taking, that's kind of known as behavioral ecology, really seems to be working well in trying to understand traits that are, you know, the traditional realm of social anthropology. In other words, very cultural traits like religious celibacy or marriage practices or marriage payments or all sorts of things to do with kinship and things like that. And in this case, I think that those aspects seem to be driving this behaviour of religious celibacy quite well. And it's not all or nothing, but within the field, there's a lot of people who are focusing on like cultural transmission. This is often sort of confusingly called cultural evolution, because I think we're all doing cultural evolution. But so these are some of the classic texts. Boyd and Richardson are a key one. Cavalli, Sforza and Fellman, looking at culture as a second inheritance system and how it's transmitted. Most of these people came from population genetics, so it doesn't have quite, it's got a strong modelling tradition, not quite such a strong empirical tradition. Whereas behavioural ecology actually came out of like people studying animal behaviour. So this is a classic text by Krebs and Davies in the 70s. They were both from the 70s, all these classic things came up. And we've just been applying that framework to human behaviour, trying to... And there's a strong empirical tradition in behavioural ecology of testing your models. So we kind of argue with each other a bit about how to explain the world. But we don't really need to, because actually one of the kind of founding fathers, really, of behavioural ecology, he was, I think he was John Krebs's supervisor's supervisor. And John Krebs was my supervisor, so Nico Tinbergen was my supervisor. And I did meet him once. I went to go and see him. He was very old when I was at Oxford. He was retired. But he was kind of, interestingly, he worked on birds all through his life. He was famous for getting a Nobel Prize for kind of founding, one of three founders of the field of animal behaviour, really. He got the Nobel Prize for medicine, because there isn't a Nobel Prize in animal behaviour, surprisingly enough. First and last time that's happened, I think. But he pointed out in a very famous way that there's sort of four ways of asking the question why. So if you want to say why be a monk, or why do anything, or in his case, why chuck eggshells out of the nest, I think was one of the things he was working on. There's four different ways you can answer that question. So you don't, and they're all correct. They're just different ways of answering the question. So you could be asking a question about mechanism, cognition, psychology, how you learnt the trait, or ontogeny, which is about development, how you learnt the trait, or nature, nurture, all that kind of question. You could be asking a question about function. Is it adaptive? Which is sort of what I've been doing. I mean, could it be beneficial to your fitness? Or you might be asking a question about phylogeny, in other words, evolutionary history. So you might say the mechanism for being a monk is that you learn this stuff as a kid, you're living in this kind of religious environment, you go to the monastery, and then you end up becoming a monk. That might be the mechanism. Whereas the function might be that you're reducing sibling competition within your household. And maybe we don't need to argue with each other because we could both be correct. And now he outlined these questions thinking about trying to understand animal behavior, but I think we've argued that this approach works really quite well with cultural behavior too. And obviously I'm not arguing that being a monk is a genetic trait, although there are some sort of analogies in the animal kingdom. For example, lots of species show some kind of reproductive suppression of some in the group and have non-reproductive individuals, or show discrimination between their offspring and have some offspring either through infanticide or whatever, not reproducing. And something like sex bias dispersal, I mean, in humans we call it kinship, we call it marriage patterns. If women disperse at marriage, we call it patrilineal, patrilocal residency. But, lots of wild species also have one sex dispersing, and we don't really call it cultural then. So the toolkit that the animal behavior people were using is so strong because you can use these fitness-based models to make very precise predictions, like, should we see monks rather than nuns in patrilocal societies? Or is there no inclusive fitness cost to making your son a monk in the harsh environment of Tibet where brothers compete for parental resources? Or does the phenotype match one that makes it look like it's under parental control? Well, they're sent really young, so that suggests it is under parental control. If it was under their own control, it wouldn't be so common. Higher female workloads when operational sex ratios are female biased. Well, these are all predictions out of behavioral ecology, and they're helping us understand cultural systems, whereas I'm not so convinced that the cultural transmission toolkit can really help us explain quite so easily why this group of people over there is doing something different from those people over there, unless you think it's somewhat random. So I guess I'm just sort of having a plea for still thinking about ecology, even when we're talking about weird cultural traits. So I better stop and thank my co-authors, who were many, because we got a lot of data. So yeah, especially Yuan, Juan, Ahau, and Alberto, whose models we've been talking about, and Li Chong, who is Tibetan, and her father was really helpful, and my funders, and all the guys who answered all our questions. Okay.
Questions first, and then you will be given the special microphone. Blah, blah, blah.
I think there's one over there.
Monks.
There's a quick. Oh.
Is it on? Okay, the transmitter seems to be working. And now? There is the first question. Perfect. So, yeah, you can pass it to the gentleman.
Thank you so much. Does it work? Yeah. I have a specific question about the data set, which shows the advantages of disadvantage for brothers of monkhood. You have shown 3 categories, 3 cohorts. Are they non-overlapping? If we go back, if it would be possible to go back to the plot, it's the slide with the horse on it.
Hang on. That's the grandfathers, and that's
this one here.
Yeah.
So say if I have one monk brother and one non-monk brother, am I in the blue as well as in the orange data set?
Yes, I don't know. This is the I think I can't quite remember what this exactly is. I think it's just putting together those that have, the writing's too small. The blue is one or more non-monk brothers. Yes. The red is one monk brother, and the black is no monk brothers. Yeah.
So with 2 brothers, of which one is a monk, I am both in blue and in orange, correct?
They possibly, looking at that.
So it's greater or equal?
Greater or equal to one monk brother? Greater or equal to non-monk brothers. Okay, so red are any monk brothers. Yep. Blue are no monk brothers. And black are no brothers at all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, next question there.
Thanks very much, Ruth, for a wonderful talk. I would stay with this picture. I'm not sure whether this is, how do I put it? So why are you actually comparing brothers? Why don't you compare kin fitness? Like, why don't you compare families? Because if it's parents who are actually pushing those kids to monastery, then wouldn't it be better to compare?
Well, we compared grandfathers and so this is like 3 generations. So you need 3 generations to get this data. And I mean, it's not a longitudinal data set in the sense that we went there in 2018 or whatever and we got all this data. So going back 3 generations was a little bit complicated because obviously some of the people were dead. But we also had to think about, so we were expecting, the model is a bit of an ESS model. If you see, it's like sort of the proportion of monks. And so it's actually quite complicated to think what the prediction would be for grandparents because if you think everything's at equilibrium, then maybe the right number of monks, if you like, are in the population and you wouldn't necessarily see much difference between the fitness of grandparents that did or didn't have a monk, if you see what I mean. So the model requires that being a monk is a benefit to your brother. I'm not sure that the model requires that it's... I'm not sure that the model predicts that we would see much difference over 3 generations, just if the system's at equilibrium, which we obviously don't know whether it is or not. So I'm just saying it's a little bit more complicated than that. It's a firm prediction of the model that your brother is at an advantage, but I'm not entirely sure that it's a firm prediction that grandfathers should be at an advantage if they have monk sons. That's all. But I might be wrong, but I'm just trying to think it through.
You are right?
Yeah.
Good evening, Professor Mace. Thank you very much for your lecture. And my question is perhaps a little bit more general, because at the beginning of the lecture you mentioned that the families, they invest quite a lot of money and they give it away for the monasteries.
Yes.
And my question was, if you send your boy there,
yes,
do you pay for his upkeep, or is it
yes,
is it entirely off your hands?
You do. You are expected to make lots of donations. That was. I mean, they do take destitute children as well, so there is an element of charitable, support for those, for orphans or whatever. But I think no, you are meant to invest in your offspring, which hence my sort of sarky comment about the exam results, because they were obviously, pressing for more donations. And there are very heavy obligations. I remember, like, they move around. If you think of it, a monk, like 1 village in 7 is a monastery. They, once every 7 years, they kind of, it's a certain village's turn to like host this big festival that gives them quite the most enormous amount of money. And I was there for one of them, and some poor family has to sort of I say poor family, I mean it's an honour, but a very expensive honour, has to kind of give, I mean it was just sacks and sacks and sacks and sacks and sacks and sacks of grain and a huge meal for everybody who was celebrating this festival, and animals, and I mean it was just extraordinary how much they were asked to give, but they sort of, that only happens like once every 7 years or something like that. So there is a lot of donation going on, but it might. Yeah, I mean we did look. I didn't have time to talk about it today. We did look at whether you gain extra status by having a child in the monastery, and you do gain a little bit of extra status by having a child in the monastery, but it is very common, so it's not like a... If your child happens to be a Buddha, that's massive. Or a Lama, yeah. That's... and that can happen by... I mean, you've probably heard stories of the Dalai Lama, you know, they'll look at the baby and they'll look for, like, birthmarks and blah, 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 blah. And that's, like, mega status if that happens. But your child obviously goes to the monastery if that happens. But I think historically, I guess there was a chance that if your son rose to the top of the establishment, he would have been very powerful individual. So maybe you also had a kind of... So they were also... They would come back and provide religious services to your family whenever you needed any religious help, or whether someone died or there was a marriage or anything like that. Monks will come and pray, or anything you needed them to come and pray for which they do get paid, actually. And so it is a very monetized system, as far as I can tell. It's large amounts of money changing hands all over the place, yes.
Another question? Okay, there's one.
Thank you. I can imagine that these is valid for the families which have multitudes of children. But nowadays in Europe we have on average 1.3, 1.6 children. Mm-hmm. And I know, for example, a few priests which have no brothers, so there's no benefit for the family. So how could you comment? And also know some young people which select actually non-religious celibate. Yes. As a voluntary selection. So how would you comment on these cases?
Yes, well, I mean, even here in China, as you know, they've got strong fertility policies now. And this, I should have mentioned, this area, you know, lots of parts of China had a one-child policy, but they were mainly like urban areas. And most ethnic minority areas had a three-child policy. So this area, since about 1980 something, have had a three-child policy, so the size of families has gone right down. And yeah, I think the system will die out. It won't. It may not survive that. I mean, it might. I guess you could conceivably have two brothers. But I think it might be last chance to see. Yeah, non-religious celibacy. Yeah. I mean, rare behaviour doesn't have to be explained in evolutionary terms. If it's very rare. But yeah, if it's very common, then, I mean, I guess you would. I guess it can arise. It could arise because people can't find a mate, and therefore, so some individuals might be. I mean, incels believe, as they say repeatedly on the internet, that some individuals have lots of mates, and therefore they have none, and they get angry about that. So. But those are by definition involuntary celibate, hence the word incel. Yeah, so voluntary celibacy. Yeah, I don't know. It doesn't. It could. The model probably doesn't make much difference between whether it's religious or not. We were just trying to explain it in a religious context, but it could be another mechanism. So this model could apply. Now, assuming that non-religious celibacy is not under parental control, then it would only be the kind of lower of those two lines. So one would only expect to see that behaviour at quite low frequency, not at such high frequency. But I think the same model would apply.
I think the existence of incels makes perfect sense from the point of view of these females, right? Like there is almost no natural selection to get the lower quality males out of the population. So they just don't reproduce by definition because they don't meet the threshold. So it's like perfectly evolutionary explained, but not from the point of view of these individuals that still strive for intercourse.
Yeah. And actually even in, I mean, if you look at demographic databases or historical databases, there's always about 10% of people who never reproduce. Yeah. Actually, and I think it's
maybe
just
even less, right? Like
or more. I mean, I mean, it might be voluntary, or it might be a failure to find a mate, or bad luck, somebody dies, or there's always quite a high proportion of individuals who don't reproduce. Yeah.
Yeah. Next question here.
These behavioral ecology explanations kind of nicely provide a clue to understand why the people decide to go to the monastery, or why the parents send their offspring to the monastery. There is always like overproduction of offspring, so and if there is some limited resources, that makes sense. But do you have any evolutionary explanation of the real behavior of the monks? You know, you showed in the beginning that they pray extensively, they spend most of the time by complex rituals and so on. So I'm wondering, you know, you were speaking about behavioral ecology, so I would expect some explanation for the behavior itself, not only the decision to go to monastery. So do you have any clue?
Yeah, I mean, there have been a number of papers now showing that these costly signals do raise your status, and that's not quite the same as saying they raise your fitness. And I'm not sure that people have really shown that they raise your fitness, but they do sometimes. But they definitely raise your status, and they raise... So people seem to evaluate your character more strongly, actually. Although, again, we found, I mean, it's quite interesting, we do have some data, which I should have shown you, on going on pilgrimage. And men get a lot of credit for going on a lot of pilgrimages. So we asked various questions about how you rate other people in your village and everything like that. And interestingly enough, women who were putting in the same effort got less status out of it. So there was a sort of definition of bias for you. They were like putting in, you know, a large amount of effort into the pilgrimage, but maybe people thought they shouldn't be spending their time doing that. They should be, you know, doing something else. But so people are tending to, I mean, we are a group living species. And we seem to be in constant sort of... We live communally, but we're always sort of constantly on the threat of conflict somehow. We're somehow having to keep groups together. I mean, some people think because warfare is very important, or just general living, you know, is a group activity, and you've got to get on with your neighbours, and you've got to coordinate various things. I mean, I think sort of, you know, like, I mean, you know, 2 decades ago, Richard Dawkins wrote The God Delusion, and he just thought religion was illogical. And the whole book was kind of like, why is everyone doing this illogical thing? And he's such a rationalist, he couldn't get over that. Like, and see that it's just a blooming adaptation. Like, he's the arch adaptationist. He, of all people, should have seen that religion is probably an adaptation because it might be helping you, you know, find a mate, raise your status, be an important person in your society. You know, it's a good way of kind of keeping rules so that you don't have to, like, be arguing about the rules all the time. You can appeal to a higher force and say these are the rules. And there's just so I think we're sort of realizing more and more that there's yes, it might be illogical, but that's, you know, natural selection doesn't work on logic. It works on fitness.
I think that, you know, for me, the status explanation is not complete, right? Because you must explain why there is high status of people who pray all the time or who go for the pilgrimage. And it is not obvious, right? That you state this, the clue to the status can be basically any, and why it is just this behavior which gets you to the status is not trivial to me.
Yeah, no, well, I agree it's not totally solved, but...
it's costly signaling, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Whatever is socially acceptable and costly can be converted to status and therefore fitness, I think. Or at least inclusive fitness.
Yeah, I was wondering whether it is like something like the handicap principle.
Well, I think it must be. And like that, what is considered a status-worthy activity does change, sometimes very quickly. But, I mean, some of these pilgrimages are absolutely honest signals of your iron levels of fitness, because no one in this room could do that for, or at least I'd be extremely surprised if anyone in this room could do that for more than a mile or two. So those people are unbelievably fit, and that there's this wonderful film called Paths of the Soul, which I do recommend, where a whole village goes on pilgrimage, and the women go too, and they like people are having babies, people are dying, and everything, but they never break this rule that every third step you have to go down, and it really is incredibly hard work. So yeah, that's honest signaling for sure. Sorry, yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. I just thought that you talked about basically the cost of becoming a monk, and we looked around what it kind of how it influences the people around the person becoming a monk. And I'm maybe more interested in, I don't know if it's necessarily your field, but I bet you'll have interesting thoughts on that. How is it perceived by that monk himself? Does it have any benefits for him? Do these children that become monks perceive these benefits, if there are any?
I mean, parents do. I mean, one thing we didn't ask too much about that, but like sometimes parents said they tried to look for like characteristics in the child that they thought meant that lifestyle would suit them. So if they're interested in like books, or if they're interested in monks, or if they weren't interested in kind of warfare, that sort of stuff, you know, they sort of tried to pick children that were suited. But I also think, I do think it is incredibly hard for them, and there's sort of horrible ethnographic accounts of these poor children like running home and escaping and being sent back, and you know, so I don't think it certainly wasn't always that they wanted to go. But there's a very big, I mean, there's a huge celebration when a child is sent to the monastery, and they're made to feel that they're doing this incredibly important thing. Whether it works, I don't know. And it used to be that the monasteries are often on a hillside, they're a little bit further away. You don't really meet women, you live in this all-male community, and you think about religious things. But now everyone's got like a mobile phone, so honestly, I don't see how the system can work. I mean, and it used to be a shame to like leave the monastery. It was really like a dishonor. And now it's quite okay to leave, and large numbers are, because the whole political climate is obviously completely different. And some children, I think, are going there sort of almost for an education, but they're learning Tibetan, which is not the most useful anymore, probably. I mean, but you know, parents always want their children to be educated, whatever's, you know, and traditionally that would have been something they would have learned. So I think it's very mixed. I think some children love it and stay on and love the community, and then others probably didn't at all. I mean, some of them get trained. I knew one of my students' brother was a monk who left the monastery, and everyone just calls him Monk. That's his name, Monk. And he was trained to be a very skilled woodworker, so he made all these amazing woodwork that they have around the temples, around the, you know, shrines and things, and he now just makes all those for people's houses and stuff like that. So sometimes they have like artistic skills or particular skills or something like that, which they can use sort of in the outside world, and so it is changing now. But I think historically you were just meant to be thinking about, you know, religious things and therefore living apart from normal life and doing that for your whole life.
Could I just come in and suggest, does reincarnation, the idea of raising your status in the next life?
Yes. Yes. I mean, that's, you know, that is a huge part of it, and that, you know, that's why you're trying to, you know, so, you know, you can accumulate karma doing all sorts of things, and if you're a monk, but there is an emphasis on suffering, so it is a very hard. It's a deliberately hard life, and I think it must be almost impossible to do if you have too much contact with the outside world. I think it worked. You know, these villages are apart and often sort of a little bit higher up on the side of a mountain or something like that. So it's yeah, I think yeah. I'm not sure the system's got too long to live in this form that I've described. But I was interested in describing it as kind of anthropological event, even if it's not, you know, changing now. Yeah.
There's no question.
Good evening. I was just wondering about the graph on the screen. What is the cause of correlation? Because, for example, if the family is poor, they have no monk boys.
Yeah.
And they have no grandchildren because the family is poor. Like, they have less grandchildren just because of that. If, like...
Yeah, we tried to control for wealth. We did have, like, the number of yaks everybody had. But, I mean, it's very hard to control for wealth because there's so many ways you can measure wealth that, you know, sometimes you can have 3 or 4 different measures of wealth and they're still having a significant effect on your outcome. So it's always a possible confound. It's really hard to get rid of the effects of wealth. Yeah, but both rich and poor families were giving children to the monastery. It wasn't like, oh, just the rich people did it or just the poor people did it.
Okay, another question? Okay, there.
In the Western society, each older brother increases probability that boy will be homosexual by about 30%. Are there similar numbers for probability of being monk?
Yeah, I mean, people have wondered whether this model could also, you know, the mathematical bits of the model could also apply to the evolution of homosexuality. And I think what's different here is, I mean, in our model, parental choice is a big part of the outcome. And I think most people believe that homosexuality has not got anything to do with parental decision making. But the model mathematically the model without the parental choice, which predicted low probabilities of monks, could, again, be so under individual control, that aspect of the model. Mathematically, I think it could be a similar model. It's very difficult to predict quantitatively because these models tend to show like patterns, but whether it's 5% or 10% or 15% is very hard to say from this kind of heuristic. They're almost heuristic models. They're trying to explain how the system works rather than predict the precise numbers. But I mean, there's a lot of anthropological communities have third genders. And I'm actually interested in doing some more research on that. And that is, I'm not quite sure to the extent that parents might be involved in that, because it's more like a culturally defined role where boys might take on a female role or girls might take on a male role. And that is, you know, that's a very interesting question. I'm actually planning on getting some more data on that.
Picking up on what was already mentioned on how these family models are changing because of changing societal norms, how are current policies by the Chinese government upon family building and how many children to have influencing these models of reproduction and family building? And if so, in what way?
There was a 3-child policy since about 1980s. So the number of siblings you have will have gone down. So, like I think, as I said before, I think the model predicts then that the number of monks we'll see will go down. And I mean, recently China's relaxed its child policy, but I think the demographic transition already happened. And even though they relaxed the child policy, I don't think people are having very many more. They're not going back as they expected them to. So it's, you know, since the policy happened, I think. I mean, there's another evolutionary puzzle which we have not really explained, is the demographic transition from high fertility to low fertility. That's happened everywhere, especially in China, in fact.
Other questions? There is one.
So maybe one question from culture transmission theory. If I have thinking that generally the main vehicles of main actors in transmission of idea of monks are parents or family more than personally. Is that true thinking?
Oh, you mean where do you get the idea from? Well,
yeah. Idea about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is true that the monasteries would like people to join. So it is true that there are institutions sort of recruiting, if you like. But I do think the decision is ultimately, or was, made by parents in this case, because, you know, the monks go as you know, children or young teenagers. So, but yeah, in terms of the, I mean, I don't know about the transmission of ideas and that sort of thing. I mean, that is quite a hard thing to study, but yeah. So I haven't really worked on that other than just from like what people say or looking at the status implications through social networks.
Maybe I have a question which is related to this. Okay. Like the ecology predicts the end state or the equilibrium state quite well, but from how the progress happened, we can actually guess quite a lot about the mechanisms of cultural transmission or about these kinds of things.
Right.
So my question is whether it was always like this, that they were recruited to the monasteries when they were 7 or 8, or whether there are like historical records showing that it started with 17, 18-year-old boys and then because these individuals had their own head already, the families were kind of like incentivized to send them there when they are younger and impressionable.
Yeah, I mean, I think yes, so there must have been some guys getting together making monasteries for them to exist in the first place, yes. Sure. And then people must have thought, hey, we can send our kids there. So yes, it must have been. So I think the sort of cultural differences provide the sort of options that you have in terms of what you do. And another point somebody raises, could this be like the same as a model of infanticide in terms of just straight, and some cultures, I mean, Tibetans don't even kill, I've seen them pick insects off the floor and take them carefully out the window, because of reincarnation belief, they don't like killing anything really. So the idea that there would be infanticide would be unthinkable, but some parts of the world have high levels of infanticide, and it might be not dissimilar models would apply.
But then on this plot you would probably see like equality between the two groups in terms of number of grandchildren, right?
Yeah, I mean, if it's this model that's working, yes.
It seems that it's better to have a monk than an infanticized.
Yes, I mean, to use a kind of, again, to take a term from I mean, there are one or two accounts that have been written of someone whose all their other children have died, have gone back to the monastery and said, can we have our son back? So it could almost be seen as like sort of a
backup.
Yeah. So it's not a. Normally it's an irreversible decision, but in extreme circumstances, maybe not.
One last question. There is one.
Good evening. It's working perfect. I had two sort of short questions. The first one being, with the demographic transition happening all around the world, do you think that this will die out everywhere then, monastery life? And the second one being, was there, it's a very loose question, but basically during the Industrial Revolution in Europe, there were enormous families. Were there, I assume the model would predict that there would be very large quantities of monks and nuns then, specifically nuns.
I think it's like the cultural context is still there to provide that option, and I think in different places it might be, the same problem might get solved in a different way, like there might be sending everyone off to the army if there's lots of wars and lots of children are being killed in war, or we already mentioned infanticide, and it wasn't uncommon in coal mining towns in Britain in the last century to 3 kids were sent down the mines, very risky, poorly paid, dangerous work, and one brother gets to go to school and in the hope that he is going to make good and rescue everyone and get a professional job or whatever. So I think the kind of, this is like we were trying to explain a particular phenomenon in Tibet, and obviously it's kind of interesting in Tibet because it was at very, very high levels there. I'm not aware of anywhere else in the world that has quite such a high proportion of individuals joining monasteries, or used to. As I say, it's not so true now, but was. So we were kind of framing the question that way round. But yeah, you could frame it the other way round, across the world there are other ways of occupying your children and stopping them reproducing, like sending them to university, for example. They can't reproduce till they're about 30, by which time there's not much time left, so they're probably only going to have one. Yes.
Okay, Thank you very much again. So please, one round of applause more for Ruth Mace. Okay, and if you still have time, the rest of the building is open for discussions. Like all the Renaissance halls are waiting for you, so you can stand around and enjoy yourselves. Thank you.